Pawn e2 to e4. Pawn e7 to e5. Knight g1 to f3. Knight b8 to c6. Bishop f1 to c4. Bishop f8 to c5. Pawn b2 to b4. Bishop c5 takes b4. Pawn c2 to c3. Bishop b4 to a5. Pawn d2 to d4. Pawn e5 takes d4. Knight f3 takes d4. Queen d8 to f6. Castle kingside. Knight g8 to e7. Knight d4 to f3. Castle kingside. Bishop c1 to g5. Queen f6 to g6. Queen d1 to a4. Rook f8 to e8. Rook f1 to e1. Pawn a7 to a6. Queen a4 to a3. Pawn d7 to d6. Queen a3 to c1. Bishop c8 to e6. Knight f3 to h4. Queen g6 to h5. Bishop c4 takes e6. Pawn f7 takes e6. Knight h4 to f3. Knight e7 to g6. Knight b1 to d2. Knight c6 to e5. Rook e1 to f1. Knight g6 to f4. Bishop g5 takes f4. Knight e5 to d3. Queen c1 to a3. Knight d3 takes f4. King g1 to h1. Bishop a5 to b6. Queen a3 to b3. Pawn d6 to d5. Rook a1 to d1. Queen h5 to g4. Pawn g2 to g3. Knight f4 to d3. Knight f3 to d4. Pawn d5 takes e4. Knight d2 to c4. Bishop b6 takes d4. Pawn c3 takes d4. Rook a8 to d8. Pawn f2 to f3. Queen g4 to g6. Queen b3 takes b7. Rook d8 takes d4. Knight c4 to e5. Queen g6 to f5. Knight e5 takes d3. Pawn e4 takes d3. Queen b7 takes c7. Queen f5 to d5. Rook d1 to d2. Rook e8 to f8. King h1 to g1. Pawn a6 to a5. Queen c7 to e7. Queen d5 to e5. King g1 to f2. Rook d4 to d6. Queen e7 to a7. Queen e5 to h5. King f2 to g2. Queen h5 to d5. Queen a7 to e3. Rook f8 to c8. Rook f1 to b1. Rook d6 to d8. Rook b1 to d1. Rook c8 to c3. King g2 to g1. Pawn e6 to e5. Pawn a2 to a4. Queen d5 to d6. Rook d1 to b1. Queen d6 to c5. Queen e3 takes c5. Rook c3 takes c5. Rook b1 to b3. Rook c5 to d5. King g1 to f2. Rook d5 to d4. King f2 to e3. Rook d4 takes a4. Rook b3 takes d3. Rook d8 takes d3, check. Rook d2 takes d3. King g8 to f7. Rook d3 to d7, check. King f7 to f6. Rook d7 to d6, check. King f6 to f7. Pawn g3 to g4. Rook a4 to a3, check. King e3 to e4. Rook a3 to b3. Rook d6 to a6. Rook b3 to b5. Rook a6 to a7, check. King f7 to f6. Rook a7 to a6, check. King f6 to g5. Rook a6 to a7. King g5 to h6. King e4 to f5. Pawn e5 to e4, check. King f5 takes e4. Pawn g7 to g5. King e4 to e3. King h6 to g6. Rook a7 to a6, check. King g6 to g7. Rook a6 to a7, check. King g7 to h6. King e3 to f2. King h6 to g6. King f2 to g3. Rook b5 to c5. Pawn h2 to h4. Pawn g5 takes h4, check. King g3 takes h4. King g6 to h6. Pawn f3 to f4. Rook c5 to c4. Pawn f4 to f5. Pawn a5 to a4. Rook a7 to a6, check. King h6 to g7. King h4 to g5. King g7 to f7. Rook a6 to a7, check. King f7 to g8. Rook a7 to a8, check. King g8 to f7. Rook a8 to a7, check. King f7 to g8. Rook a7 to a8, check. King g8 to f7. Rook a8 to a5. Rook c4 to b4. Rook a5 to a7, check. King f7 to g8. Pawn f5 to f6. Pawn h7 to h6, check. King g5 to h5. Rook b4 to c4. Pawn g4 to g5. Pawn h6 takes g5. King h5 to g6. Rook c4 to c8. Rook a7 to g7, check. King g8 to f8. Rook g7 to h7. King f8 to e8. Rook h7 to h8, check. King e8 to d7. Rook h8 takes c8. King d7 takes c8. Pawn f6 to f7. King c8 to c7. Pawn f7 to f8, promoting to queen. King c7 to c6. Queen f8 to e8, check. King c6 to c5. Queen e8 takes a4. Pawn g5 to g4. Queen a4 takes g4. King c5 to d5. King g6 to f6. King d5 to c5. King f6 to e5. King c5 to c6. Queen g4 to b4. King c6 to c7. King e5 to d5. King c7 to d7. Queen b4 to b7, check. King d7 to e8. King d5 to a6. King e8 to d8. Queen b7 to d7, checkmate.